During the 1980s, it seemed the CIA had just one obsession, and it wore a colonel's uniform in Tripoli. For a time, killing Gaddafi wasn't just a mission. It was the CIA's full-time job, its waking thought, its singular pursuit wrapped in satellite images and classified cables. They killed Gaddafi because he dreamed too big. There are stories we hear, and then there are stories we're not supposed to hear. This is one of those. It begins in the burning heart of North Africa, where a young Bedouin soldier named Muammar Gaddafi once stood on red Libyan soil, barefoot, brown-skinned, and fearless, and declared something the West never forgave him for. Africa will be free, not tomorrow, today. That one sentence would haunt Washington, Paris, and London for decades. Because it wasn't just rhetoric. It wasn't a slogan for rallies. It was a blueprint for the end of white supremacy's global order. And they knew it. Most people think Gaddafi was killed because of a revolution. They think it was the Arab Spring. They think the Libyan people rose and America helped them get freedom. But that's not what happened. Not even close. The truth, the real blood-stained truth, is that Muammar Gaddafi was hunted down, tortured, and publicly executed by a NATO-backed hit squad because he threatened Western power in Africa. Not by terror, not by war, not by lies, but by freedom. Real, economic, black freedom. He wanted Africa to have its gold-backed currency. He wanted African oil to stay in African hands. He wanted Western troops out. He wanted African nations to stop borrowing dollars, euros, and CFA francs and start printing their destiny. He wasn't asking for a seat at their table. He was flipping the table, and for that, he had to go. But how was the man, the legend, the hero of Libya killed? Let's find out. Sirte, Libya, October 20th, 2011, the day Gaddafi was killed. It didn't end on a battlefield or in a courtroom. It ended in the back of a pickup truck, surrounded by dust, shouts, and cell phone cameras. Muammar Gaddafi, once feared by the West, once called the King of Kings in Africa, was now cornered, beaten, and bleeding. No more speeches, no escape. The man who outlasted coup attempts, sanctions, and airstrikes was dying in the most chaotic way possible. And the world watched, not with shock, but with silence. There was no arrest. It was a live-streamed lynching, orchestrated behind the scenes by powers that would never show their faces. And then, the final blow. The bullet entered his skull, just above the ear. Just like that, the man once called Africa's lion was gone. Within hours, the footage flooded global news. Networks from CNN to BBC looped it again and again. The tyrant, the dictator, the villain, finally dead. They framed it as a victory. Libya is free, they declared. The people have spoken. But no one asked the real question. Why did they want him dead? Not captured? Not tried? Not heard? Why was Gaddafi dragged into the shadows of Sirte and executed like a war criminal, when other world leaders were given courts, translators, suits, and microphones? Why was his body paraded, frozen, on display like a cursed artifact? Why did Hillary Clinton, then US Secretary of State, laugh on camera and say, "We came, we saw, he died"? Who was the we? Who was pulling the strings? Because what happened in Sirte wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't justice. It was a kill order, silent, sanctioned, and decades in the making. Gaddafi had seen the end coming. He had watched Libya's skies fill with NATO planes. He had read the cables, intercepted the messages, and decoded the betrayal. But even in those final days, he held onto hope that perhaps someone would listen, that perhaps the African Union would intervene, that maybe, just maybe, the world would remember that he didn't start this war. But hope is dangerous when you're the target of a machine that prints its truth, because the West didn't want Gaddafi captured. They didn't want him speaking in The Hague. They didn't want him alive long enough to expose what they had done with him, and to him, for decades. The secret torture programs, the CIA black sites, the oil deals, the Sarkozy bribes, the gold dinar plan. He knew too much, and worse, he still believed. Even on the run, even hunted, Gaddafi clutched a bloodied copy of his Green Book. He told his guards that Libya was not falling, It was mutating. That the resistance would live underground, like fire under sand. But in the eyes of NATO, that made him even more dangerous. The men who executed him didn't do it for Libya. They did it for the audience. To show the world what happens when a leader refuses to kneel, to prove that it's not enough to lose power, you must be humiliated, defaced, and deleted. That's why they didn't just kill Gaddafi. They filmed it. They leaked it. They celebrated it. It wasn't about the man anymore. It was about the warning. Don't try to build your bank. Don't try to free your continent. Don't try to trade oil for gold. Don't try to kick us out. Because if you do, you'll die in a ditch too. The day he died was the end of a hunt that began long before the Arab Spring, long before NATO, and long before Libya was branded a pariah. To figure out how long before it started, we need to go back. We rewind the tape. We enter the war rooms, the bank vaults, the oil fields, and the panic rooms of Washington, Paris, and London, to expose why Gaddafi was marked for death the moment he said, "We don't need them anymore." If you listen to the official version, it all sounds so neat. Gaddafi was a dictator. He funded terrorists. He ruled with fear. He killed his people. So the world got together and helped Libya liberate itself. That's the bedtime story. But the real version is much uglier. And it starts in a room with no windows, somewhere in Langley, Virginia, where CIA analysts weren't worried about human rights violations or nightclub bombings. They were worried about something else. What if Africa stops borrowing money? What if oil starts being sold in gold? What if African nations stop asking permission? And every time they asked those questions, the same face appeared in their reports: Muammar Gaddafi. He wasn't the only leader to challenge them, but he was the only one with oil, gold, guts, and a vision to bring it all together. That's why they couldn't ignore him. That's why they couldn't outweight him. That's why, in the end, they had to kill him. It all started in 1969, when Gaddafi overthrew King Idris. He inherited a country that was technically independent but functionally colonized. The US ran military bases out of Libya. British companies controlled oil. France treated North Africa like a backyard. And Libyan wealth, that endless black gold flowing beneath the desert, was pouring into Western banks while Libyan children died of malnutrition. Gaddafi's first crime wasn't brutality. It was a rejection. He kicked the Americans out. He kicked the British out. He nationalized oil. And with the stroke of a pen, billions of dollars that once flowed into Wall Street in London stopped. To Western leaders, it felt like robbery. They didn't see it as Libya reclaiming its resources. They saw it as a declaration of war on their financial empires. And they never forgot. Let's get this out of the way. The CIA didn't want Gaddafi dead because he didn't have clean hands. They say he supported rebel groups. He funded resistance movements. He said things that scared diplomats. But that's not what made the CIA stay up at night. What terrified them, what they couldn't say out loud, was that he was working. Despite decades of sanctions and smear campaigns, Libya under Gaddafi had the highest human development index in Africa, free healthcare and free education, state-subsidized housing and electricity, and a debt-free economy with one of the strongest African currencies. Gaddafi was proving, not just preaching, that Africa didn't need the West. And in a world run by banks and bombs, that's a death sentence. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi was done playing defense. He was tired of watching African nations crawl to the IMF with begging bowls. Tired of seeing leaders cut deals in euros and dollars for their gold and oil. So he proposed the ultimate betrayal, a single African currency backed by gold, one that would replace the dollar, the euro, and especially the French-controlled CFA franc used in 14 African countries. And he didn't just talk, he began stockpiling gold. He began forming a coalition of African central banks. He began urging oil producers to sell in dinars, not dollars. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a blueprint, a working, terrifying blueprint. To the Federal Reserve and European Central Bank, this wasn't just economic sabotage. It was an act of war. Because if oil stopped being traded in dollars, the entire US economy would shake. If the CFA zone broke away, France would lose its grip on West Africa. And if Africa had its bank, its currency, its capital. Who would need the World Bank anymore? Gaddafi wasn't just challenging the system, he was building its replacement. And that's when they knew he wasn't just inconvenient. He was too dangerous to be allowed to live. It wasn't just his dreams. It was his memory. Gaddafi had survived Reagan's airstrikes. He had outlived Cold War assassination attempts. He had made deals with the US after 9/11, then watched those same people turn on him. He had hosted CIA black sites, and he had records. He knew the names. He knew the amounts. He had receipts, literal documents detailing the West's darkest backdoor operations in Africa and the Middle East. And as the world moved closer to the Arab Spring, the fear wasn't just what Gaddafi was doing, it was what he might reveal. They couldn't risk him being captured. They couldn't risk him testifying. So by 2010, in meetings that would never appear in the minutes, a quiet consensus was forming in Western capitals. If the chance comes, he doesn't leave Libya alive. While strategists whispered in war rooms, Western media worked overtime to lay the emotional groundwork. They painted Gaddafi as insane, a tyrant, a clown, a delusional dictator with a weird tent and female bodyguards. They made people laugh at him, to make them forget he had once terrified the West with nothing but oil, gold, and a microphone. Every caricature, every scandal, every wild rumor served one purpose: to make you stop listening. Because if you listened closely, you'd hear what he was saying, and that was a problem. By late 2010, something had shifted. Gaddafi's African projects were gaining speed. Talks of a sovereign African bank were no longer hypothetical. Even heads of state once wary of his bravado were now taking meetings behind closed doors. In Paris, Sarkozy was panicking. In DC, Hillary Clinton's team was watching closely. In London, MI6 had begun making contingency plans. They were losing their grip, and the world was about to change, not by revolution, but by currency. And so, when protests erupted in Benghazi in February 2011, they didn't see chaos. They saw an opportunity. On April 15, 1986, at exactly 2 a.m., the sky over Tripoli tore open, not with rain, not with thunder, but with the roar of American F-111 fighter jets. They weren't just passing through. They were low, fast, and deadly, cutting across the Mediterranean like blades, their engines screaming over the rooftops of a sleeping city. But they weren't aiming for a military base or a bunker. Their target was a man, asleep in his home with his wife, his children, and his guards. The operation had a name: El Dorado Canyon. But stripped of its codename and Pentagon paperwork, it was something far simpler: a direct attempt to assassinate Muammar Gaddafi, authorized from the Oval Office itself. Just 10 days earlier, a bomb had exploded at La Belle Discothèque in West Berlin. 3 people were killed, including 2 American soldiers. Over 200 others were injured. The outrage was real, but so was the timing. Within hours, the White House didn't just suggest that Libya was responsible, it declared it. No investigation, no due process, just a conviction. The evidence? An intercepted cable, a vague phone call, some unnamed sources. None of it was shared. None of it was independently verified. But it didn't matter. Ronald Reagan wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a target. And Gaddafi had been at the top of the list for years. The Berlin bombing became the perfect excuse. The fast-track justification to do what had been sitting on CIA desks for too long: take him out. At exactly 1:54 a.m. on April 15, 1986, 18 American warplanes, fueled mid-air over the Mediterranean and cleared through British airspace, screamed toward Tripoli and Benghazi. In less than 12 minutes, they dropped over 60 tons of explosives. And this wasn't limited to radar sites or military barracks. They struck homes, schools, and Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's compound. One bomb landed just meters from where his adopted 15-month-old daughter Hannah was sleeping. She died instantly, her small body crushed beneath the rubble. No one called it a mistake. The official line was collateral damage. But behind the sanitized language was a truth no one wanted to say out loud. The mission had failed to kill Gaddafi, but it had sent a message. It told him and the world that the US knew where he lived, and they had no problem trying again. The next morning, Gaddafi emerged on camera, blood on his clothes, dust on his face. But he didn't collapse. He didn't plead. He looked into the lens and spoke, not with rage, but with cold certainty. He called the airstrike an act of war. He blamed imperialism, and he swore revenge, not just for his daughter, but for every African child buried under Western bombs, debt, and deceit. Across the continent, the world listened. Protests erupted outside U.S. embassies in Senegal, Ghana, and Tanzania. In apartheid South Africa, ANC fighters praised him as a symbol of resistance. Even in New York's Harlem, demonstrators took to the streets, because while Reagan painted him as a madman, many Black Americans saw something different. A man who stood up and didn't bow. From a military standpoint, Reagan's strike failed. They killed a baby. They didn't kill their target. And in doing so, they transformed Gaddafi from a strongman into something far more dangerous, a symbol. His survival gave him the aura of being untouchable, not just a leader, but a specter. Inside the CIA, internal assessments grew cautious. One memo warned that killing Gaddafi might plunge Libya into civil war. Another warned of a continent-wide backlash, given Gaddafi's rising popularity across Africa. But more than anything, they feared the unknown, that if Gaddafi died, someone worse, quieter, and more calculated might replace him, so the direct kill orders were shelved. Instead, the US switched tactics and began a longer, quieter war, one that would stretch for 25 years until NATO finally took the shot they missed in 1986. After the failure of El Dorado Canyon, the mission shifted from assassination to erosion. The new plan was to bleed Gaddafi out slowly. Libya was targeted with brutal sanctions designed to strangle its economy. Disinformation campaigns painted Gaddafi as irrational, unhinged, and unstable. Intelligence assets were planted to break alliances, sow distrust, and fund exiled opposition figures who would later return wearing the title of revolutionaries. The aim was no longer regime change through shock. It was regime decay through patience. Yet despite it all, Gaddafi endured. In 1999, he handed over the Lockerbie bombing suspects to Britain. In 2003, he shocked the world again by voluntarily surrendering Libya's WMD programs. He welcomed UN weapons inspectors, reopened oil contracts, shook hands with Tony Blair, and even posed for photos with Condoleezza Rice. But none of it mattered. Compliance didn't move the crosshairs off his forehead, because his greatest crime, in Western eyes, wasn't Lockerbie or Berlin. It was that even after all that, he still refused to kneel. Gaddafi understood that his survival was unacceptable to the West. He never pretended otherwise. In speeches, he mocked Reagan by name. He referred to US presidents as liars hiding behind flags. At an African Union summit in 2005, he said it plainly: "The bombs they dropped on me, they wanted to drop on all of you. Because you want to be free. Because you want to print your own money. Because you want to own your land." By then, he wasn't just speaking for Libya. He had positioned himself as the voice of a continent, and he knew the price that came with that. In 1992, Libya wasn't under siege from tanks or drones. There were no airstrikes, no firefights on television, no assassins on rooftops, and no American jets screaming overhead. Yet the country was bleeding, slowly, invisibly, not from bullets, but from silence. The United Nations, under intense pressure from Washington and London, had imposed a new wave of crippling economic sanctions. Planes couldn't land, embassies shuttered, foreign deals vanished overnight. It wasn't a military strike, it was a financial quarantine. And inside his compound in Tripoli, Muammar Gaddafi understood exactly what was happening. They weren't trying to invade him, they were trying to erase him. After the failed 1986 airstrike, Western powers recognized a hard truth. Killing Gaddafi outright could backfire. It could turn him into a martyr. But dismantling his image, choking his economy, and isolating him from the world, that could turn him into something worse. A ghost, a presence without power. They didn't need more bombs. What they needed was control, of optics, of narrative, of perception. That's where the Lockerbie bombing came in. On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 270 people on board. The tragedy was global. The response was swift. And once again, as with Berlin 2 years earlier, the blame landed on Libya. No trial, no public evidence, just whispers passed between intelligence agencies and urgent declarations from Western governments. Soon, Libya was cast as the villain, and Gaddafi was the face of state-sponsored terror. The West demanded that Libya hand over 2 suspects, Gaddafi resisted, calling for a neutral international court. They responded with economic war, trade freezes, air travel bans, and oil embargoes. Libya, already isolated, now faced a near-total strangulation. The effects were devastating. Food imports collapsed, prices soared, banking systems were severed from the global economy. Projects that were meant to develop Libya stalled indefinitely. But the real cost went beyond Libya. It hit the entire African continent. Despite his flaws, Gaddafi was the financial engine behind countless African liberation movements, infrastructure funds, and Pan-African institutions. The sanctions weren't just about Lockerbie. They were designed to cut off the bloodstream of Africa's revolutionary future. By the late 1990s, Gaddafi had few options. The Arab world had distanced itself. African economies were under pressure. Western influence was growing. So he adapted, not out of trust, but out of strategy. In 1999, he handed over the Lockerbie suspects. Sanctions were eased. By 2003, he went further than anyone expected. He publicly announced that Libya was giving up its weapons of mass destruction. UN inspectors were invited in. He opened up to the West, reached out to Washington, and welcomed European partnerships. He shook hands with Tony Blair. He posed for photos with US diplomats, but none of it was surrendered. It was a tactical pause, a maneuver to buy time, stabilize Libya, rebuild lost alliances in Africa, and prepare for the next phase. Gaddafi knew they would never truly accept him. They only smile, he warned privately, until the next trap is ready. For a brief moment, the West played along. Major newspapers softened their tone. The BBC offered interviews framing him as reformed. Oil companies quietly returned to explore Libyan fields. But behind the curtain, intelligence reports still labeled him a threat. He continued to fund African Union programs that bypassed the IMF and World Bank. He spoke of a gold-backed currency to liberate African economies. He rejected the presence of foreign military bases on African soil. The facade of reform was allowed but never believed. The mission now wasn't to kill the man. It was to kill the myth, to recast him in the public mind as a clown, then a lunatic, then a villain. Each phase served the same purpose, to make sure no African saw a visionary in him. And all the while, the economic warfare continued. Libya's overseas assets were routinely frozen. African banks tied to Libyan investment faced endless financial audits. Nations that partnered with Libya were warned discreetly to distance themselves. The country's sovereign wealth fund, valued at over $65 billion, was under constant surveillance. Every time Gaddafi attempted to redirect those funds toward African-led development, a sudden media scandal would break, conveniently casting doubt or stirring international controversy. It wasn't just isolation, it was containment, a geopolitical message. Stay away from Libya, or suffer the same fate. By 2006, Gaddafi had seen enough. He had done everything the West had asked. He had surrendered weapons. He had paid compensation. He had cooperated on terrorism. He had allowed foreign companies access to Libyan markets. And still, the pressure never let up. It became clear that the West didn't want a partnership. It wanted control. So Gaddafi reversed course. He re-centered Libya's vision on Africa. He doubled funding for continental infrastructure, renewed calls for the United States of Africa, pushed for an independent African satellite program, and, most provocatively, revived the gold dinar plan, bolder and louder than ever. In 2009, at an African Union summit, he said what many had feared but few dared to voice. "We made a mistake trusting them. They cannot be partners. They only know how to conquer." That quote didn't make it to CNN, but it was heard, in silence, inside every Western war room. Because with that speech, Gaddafi made it clear the cooperation phase was over, and the next move wouldn't be financial. It would be final. For over a century, Africa had been independent on paper, but enslaved by numbers. While many countries printed their own money, much of it was backed by nothing. Worse still, several African nations didn't even control their currencies. In West and Central Africa, 14 nations remained shackled under the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency printed in Paris, managed by the French treasury, and guaranteed to prioritize French interests. In other parts of the continent, IMF and World Bank loans forced governments to borrow in dollars and euros, saddling them with crushing interest rates before their economies even stood a chance. Every time an African government wanted to build a school, fund a road, or pay its workers, it needed foreign permission, approval from Western lenders, and conditions from former colonizers. That wasn't sovereignty. That was economic servitude. Gaddafi had seen enough. His vision was simple but revolutionary. What if Africa stopped borrowing money it never printed, and instead created a currency backed by something it owned in abundance? Gold. Libya, at the time, held one of the largest gold reserves on the continent, approximately 143 tons, worth billions. Those gold bars weren't collecting dust in vaults beneath Tripoli. To Gaddafi, they were the foundation for a new African financial system, one that would free the continent from the grip of the IMF, the World Bank, and European monetary institutions. Under his plan, Libya's gold would anchor a new continental currency, the gold dinar. Oil-rich nations like Algeria, Angola, and Nigeria could join the system, accepting gold-backed payments instead of US dollars. African central banks could coordinate under a single reserve standard, using Africa's resources, gold, oil, diamonds, to determine value, not foreign inflation. The project was essentially a financial union of OPEC and the African Union, minus the West. No France, no IMF, no Euro. Just Africa, on its terms. The geopolitical impact would have been seismic. First, the global petrodollar system, which since the 1970s required oil to be traded in US dollars, would come under direct threat. If even a few African producers began accepting gold dinars for oil, demand for the US dollar would drop, weakening America's ability to borrow, print, and control global trade. Second, the CFA franc zone would face a full-blown revolt. If Gaddafi's plan succeeded, countries shackled to France's colonial currency would have an alternative, and France would lose billions in annual profits and a key lever of power. Finally, it would expose the fragility of the Western financial model itself. Because if Africa could build its currency, backed by real resources and untainted by debt, then why not Latin America? Why not Southeast Asia? It wouldn't just challenge Western dominance, it would shatter the illusion that their system was the only one possible. Western intelligence knew all of this. By 2006, both French and American agencies were monitoring the Dinar project closely. And in 2011, a leaked memo from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, uncovered in Hillary Clinton's infamous emails, confirmed it. The document stated clearly that Gaddafi's gold-backed currency plan posed a serious threat to the monetary stability of the CFA franc zone. Translation: if we don't stop this, we lose Africa. Of the 5 reasons listed to justify NATO's intervention in Libya, the first wasn't human rights, terrorism, or democracy. It was this: Gaddafi's gold reserves and his plan to challenge the French-controlled financial system. The war, in truth, wasn't about bombs. It was about banknotes. Gaddafi wasn't subtle about his ambitions either. At African Union summits, he urged leaders to reject IMF loans and join his monetary union. He offered to pay the membership fees of poorer nations to bring them into the project. He mocked European bankers who claimed Africa's currencies needed external stability. He proposed a full suite of financial institutions: an African monetary fund, an African central bank, and an African investment bank, all backed by African resources, owned by Africans. In one speech in 2009, he said, "The African Union must have one currency, one bank, and one army. We have oil, we have gold, we have youth. What do we lack? Nothing but the courage to break the chains." His words were met with applause from the audience. But in Paris and Washington, they weren't clapping, they were planning. What scared the West most was that Gaddafi's plan wasn't radical, it was rational. It wasn't violent or ideological. It was grounded in basic economic logic, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. A madman can be ignored. A genius with gold and a continent behind him? That's a threat you eliminate. By 2010, the plan was gaining traction. South Africa was in discussions. Nigeria's central bank was quietly supporting regional alternatives. The African Monetary Fund was in draft form. Gaddafi had even begun selling oil outside of the dollar in limited contracts. The project was accelerating, and the West knew it had to act before it became unstoppable. Every empire has its red line. For the US, it was Saddam Hussein switching to euros. For France, it was Ivory Coast hinting at independence from the CFA franc. But for Libya, the line was crossed when Gaddafi moved to formally announce the gold dinar, backed by African partners and gold reserves already in place. At that point, a decision was made. All they needed was a spark, any spark. When protests erupted in Libya in February 2011, they had their excuse. And what followed wasn't an intervention. It was an execution, not of a regime, not of a man, but of an idea. Because once that coin was minted, it wouldn't just be a new currency, it would be a revolution. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue now. In September 2009, Muammar Gaddafi did what the West never imagined he would do. On the 23rd, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, world leaders sat under the Golden Dome, dressed in polished suits, eyes glazed over after hours of carefully staged diplomacy. The air was thick with protocol, politeness, and pretense. But when Gaddafi entered the hall, everything shifted. He didn't walk in like a man grateful to be included. He walked in like he owned the room. Dressed in his signature robe, he moved with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. His eyes scanned the crowd not like a guest, but like a hunter. Clutched tightly under his arm was a copy of the UN Charter. But he wasn't there to honor it. He was there to tear it apart, page by page, lie by lie. His speech was scheduled to last 15 minutes. It went on for 96, and in those 96 minutes, he didn't just criticize global power, he exposed it. With the entire world watching, Gaddafi ripped the UN Charter in half and held it up at the podium. "This," he said, "is not worth the paper it's written on." The hall fell into stunned silence. This wasn't theater. It was a direct assault on the illusion of world order. And for those who understood what they were witnessing, it was a declaration of war, not with weapons, but with truth. Then he turned his sights to the post-World War II power structure. The Security Council, he declared, is terrorism itself. He called the permanent members war criminals, accused them of hijacking the UN, and said the organization was ruled not by justice, but by those who held nuclear weapons. He accused the US, the UK, and France of using the United Nations as cover for invasions, regime change, and corporate theft. NATO, he said, operated like a gang. The World Bank was a financial weapon of mass destruction. Africa, he thundered, remained enslaved, not in chains, but in contracts. There were no attempts to soften his tone. No diplomat dared shift the conversation. No Western leader laughed. They just sat, silent and sweating, while Gaddafi said out loud what they had spent decades paying others not to say. Then came the moment that truly shattered the room, the demand for reparations. Gaddafi didn't just condemn colonialism in vague moral terms. He came with numbers. Calmly, he stated what Europe and America owed Africa for centuries of extraction, enslavement, and theft: $7.7 trillion. Not as a political talking point, but as an invoice. Oil, diamonds, rubber, labor. He itemized the cost of the empire. And as he spoke, no one in the room interrupted. While the Western world dismissed him publicly, they knew that this message was not falling on deaf ears. Across Africa, across the global South, people were listening. In the second half of the speech, he turned to his continent. He didn't scold it. He challenged it. "Why are we still asking for help from those who looted us?" he asked. "Why are we afraid to print our own money? Why are our armies trained in France, not Africa? Why is the World Bank headquartered in Washington, not Lagos?" He didn't just call for African unity. He demanded an African Union that meant something. He pushed again for a single currency, a continental army, and an independent media network to counter Western narratives. He looked directly into the cameras and warned, "If we do not build this, we will be colonized again." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a prediction. It was a warning. And those who later planned Libya's liberation 2 years later heard every word. Publicly, Western diplomats played it cool. They brushed him off as eccentric, outdated, and dramatic. But behind closed doors, they panicked. American diplomats filed urgent cables warning that Gaddafi's speech was gaining traction across Africa. French officials circulated internal memos advising how to spin the reparations demand as unrealistic. British think tanks encouraged the media to shift coverage back to Iran and terrorism. Because Gaddafi hadn't just gone off script, he had burned the script in front of the world. He had reminded everyone watching that the UN was built by the victors of war. That democracy was too often imposed by bombs, not ballots. That Africa was still being looted, legally this time, through trade agreements and financial policy. And worst of all, he didn't say it with rage. He said it with facts. That was the final threat. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't delusional. He was accurate and powerful, and far too dangerous to keep around. He never returned to the United Nations after 2009. The doors were quietly closed. No more invitations. But it didn't matter. He had already said everything he needed to say. In the months and years that followed, the campaign to dismantle Gaddafi intensified. Western media resurrected the madman label. Intelligence agencies expanded surveillance. The pressure mounted. Because after that day in New York, Gaddafi wasn't just a rebel leader or an oil-rich strongman. He had become something worse in the eyes of the empire. A mirror held up to a global order built on double standards, selective justice, and controlled narratives. And in a world like that, mirrors are more dangerous than missiles. That's when the Western world had to do something, and they tried to find Gaddafi's old links, one from 2007. It began, like many political crimes do, with a handshake and a lie. In 2007, French presidential candidate Nicolas Sarkozy was desperate. Desperate for power, desperate for funding, and desperate to win. Behind closed doors, his campaign was bleeding money faster than French media could ask where it was coming from. Then came an offer, from Tripoli, from a man with oil, gold, and no patience for Western hypocrisy. Muammar Gaddafi, the same Libyan leader Sarkozy had once publicly condemned, was ready to bankroll his campaign. It wasn't a favor. It wasn't charity. It was a transaction. Gaddafi had a vision for Africa's future, and he needed a French president who owed him everything. Sarkozy said yes. And 5 years later, he returned the favor with bombs. According to multiple investigations, intelligence leaks, and court documents, Gaddafi's regime funneled up to 50 million euros into Sarkozy's 2007 campaign. The money moved through intermediaries, secret bank accounts, and unofficial channels. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. Libyan officials confirmed it. Financial transfers were traced. French investigators launched a formal probe. And in 2018, Sarkozy was detained by police as part of the unfolding scandal. The timeline tells the story. In 2007, Gaddafi backed Sarkozy's rise to power. In 2008, he visited Paris, where Sarkozy welcomed him with red carpets and photo ops. In 2009, Gaddafi delivered his infamous UN speech that rattled Western powers. By 2010, his plan for a gold-backed African currency was gaining momentum. And in 2011, Sarkozy became the first Western leader to call for military action against Libya. Sarkozy didn't suddenly become concerned about human rights. He became concerned that Gaddafi might talk. And Gaddafi, true to form, began to threaten just that. By early 2011, whispers were coming out of Tripoli. Libyan officials were reportedly preparing to release evidence of the 50 million euro bribe, emails, documents, wire transfers, names. The French media caught wind of it. WikiLeaks was watching. The CIA was already listening. Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, made the threat plain. We funded Sarkozy's campaign, and we have the receipts. This wasn't a warning. It was political dynamite, capable of blowing open the entire illusion of Western democracy. Sarkozy moved quickly. He lobbied NATO, rallied the UN, and rebranded himself as the moral voice urging intervention in Libya. But behind the podium, what fueled him wasn't morality. It was panic. Because if Gaddafi spoke, he wouldn't just ruin one presidency. He could blow the lid off a system funded with African money and hidden behind Western suits. Just a few years earlier, Gaddafi had been honored as a guest of the French Republic. He pitched his Bedouin tent in the heart of Paris. He shook hands with Sarkozy beneath crystal chandeliers. They posed for cameras, discussed nuclear deals, and talked about a new era of Franco-Libyan partnership. But it was all theater. Once the campaign cash was secured and the photos published, Sarkozy turned back to his instincts, and Gaddafi turned back to Africa. The gold dinar moved forward. African heads of state rallied behind the idea of economic liberation, and Gaddafi began threatening again to reveal the truth. That's when Sarkozy turned. As protests erupted in Libya during the Arab Spring, Sarkozy didn't hesitate. He pushed the UN for authorization. He urged NATO to act immediately. He framed the airstrikes as a humanitarian mission, but behind the scenes, he sent French special forces into Libya before the resolution even passed. not to protect civilians, but to silence a man who might soon say, "I bought the French presidency." Sarkozy wasn't alone in his fear. The moment Gaddafi's inner circle began leaking information about the bribe, other Western leaders grew nervous. If Sarkozy had accepted money, who else had? Western oil executives had secured secret contracts with Libya for years. European heads of state visited Tripoli regularly. Gaddafi had hosted CIA black sites during the War on Terror, and he kept meticulous records. He had enough documentation to blackmail entire governments. And worse, he wasn't bluffing. He was threatening to make it all public. That's why, when NATO launched its war on Libya, it wasn't about freedom or democracy. It was about containment. It was a rapid, violent erasure of a man who had too many secrets and no fear of using them. It began, like many modern regime changes, beneath the surface of protest. In February 2011, Libya started to tremble. Small groups of demonstrators gathered in Benghazi. Their chants echoed the voices rising across the Arab world. The revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt had ignited something deeper. The belief that no dictatorship was safe, that even decades of fear could crack under the weight of a single collective shout. For the first time in years, Libya's silence broke. The people, long suffocated by security forces and surveillance, stepped into the streets. It felt raw. It felt organic. It felt like a revolution. But in Washington, in London, and NATO war rooms across Europe, what was happening in Libya didn't look like a surprise. It looked like an opening. The intelligence agencies didn't scramble to understand what was happening. They adjusted their plans. Because for them, this wasn't the start of something new. It was the moment they had been waiting for. And within days, what had begun as a national uprising was co-opted and weaponized. Foreign operatives slipped into place. Cash flowed, arms moved. And Libya, a sovereign nation, became a chessboard, a stage, a covert operation in motion. Leaked Pentagon files, US military testimony, and later public disclosures revealed the truth that was buried beneath the headlines. By early 2011, CIA operatives were already inside Libya, not as diplomats or observers, but as active participants. They were embedded with rebel groups. They were gathering intelligence, training insurgents, and identifying key targets for elimination. One leaked quote from a US military planner published years later was chilling in its simplicity. "We were inside before the first flag was burned, before the first camera rolled. We were already in position." This wasn't a case of Western nations reacting to a humanitarian emergency. It was evidence of a long-prepared framework, now being executed in real time. The official justification arrived quickly and predictably. "Protect civilians," they said. It was the same script used in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Kosovo. But this time, it was wrapped in the urgent language of humanitarianism. The world was told that Muammar Gaddafi was preparing to commit genocide against his people. The United Nations was rushed into passing Resolution 1973, a legal fig leaf that allowed a no-fly zone over Libya. But buried in the resolution's text, there was no authorization for regime change, no call to remove Gaddafi, no approval for direct military involvement on the ground. And yet, within days, NATO warplanes were striking Libyan infrastructure. US drones were in the sky. British and French special forces were guiding rebel units. CIA field teams were feeding real-time intelligence to armed factions. Covert supply chains delivered advanced weapons into the hands of militias. The resolution had been signed in the name of peace. It was being used to wage a silent war of assassination. This wasn't about protecting civilians. It was about decapitating a government. The global public watched, unaware that what they were witnessing wasn't intervention. It was orchestrated regime collapse. The so-called rebel groups that emerged on Western media screens as freedom fighters were far from grassroots revolutionaries. Many of them had been trained long before 2011, some by British and American forces in military camps in Chad and Jordan. Some had fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Many had ties to radical Islamist movements. The most powerful among them was the Libyan Islamic fighting group LIFG, a faction once listed as a terrorist organization known to have links with Al-Qaeda. But when the time came to remove Gaddafi, those labels were erased. Former militants became revolutionaries. Extremists became allies. They were armed, trained, and given air support by the same Western powers that had once sworn to fight terrorism. One intelligence official later admitted, "We outsourced the revolution to jihadists because they hated Gaddafi even more than we did. It was a deal born of convenience, not principle, and it came with consequences the world is still living with." As the months wore on, NATO dropped over 7,700 bombs on Libya. Targets included government buildings, military bases, infrastructure, and suspected command sites. But the real target was never a city or a convoy. It was always Gaddafi himself. The air campaign was not defensive. It was surgical. His movements were tracked by surveillance drones. His communications were intercepted. His locations were marked and relayed to rebels on the ground. His every step narrowed the net. The public was told this was a civil war. But it was, in truth, a foreign military operation, coordinated from satellites and bunkers thousands of miles away. The endgame was never democracy. It was eliminated. When Gaddafi was finally caught in Sirte on October 20th, 2011, his convoy had been targeted by a NATO drone and bombed before ground forces moved in. He was captured alive, dragged through the streets, beaten, stabbed, and executed on camera. He never stood trial. He never testified. He was silenced before he could speak. And across Western media, his death was celebrated. The headlines declared Libya free. The context, the coordination, the lies, the foreign fingerprints was buried. As the bombs fell, another weapon was being deployed. The media, news outlets in the US and Europe portrayed Libya as a country on the brink of a democratic rebirth. They amplified unverified stories that Gaddafi had supplied his troops with Viagra to commit mass rape, that he had hired African mercenaries to slaughter civilians, and that he was preparing to burn Libya to the ground. Almost none of it was supported by evidence. Much of it was later disproved, but truth was never the objective. The goal was to shape public perception, to manufacture consent for intervention, to make the invasion feel righteous, and to transform a public execution into a victory for freedom. The headlines didn't say, "Africa's most independent leader murdered in NATO-backed operation." They said, "Libya is free," and with those words, a decade of suffering began. In his final weeks, Gaddafi still believed the African Union might step in. He thought, perhaps, the world would see what was happening. But deep down, he understood what he was facing. They are not fighting for freedom. They are fighting for the right to steal. They will kill me. They will kill Libya. But history will remember this. He was not wrong. Libya today is not free. It is broken. It is scarred. There are open-air slave markets. Warring militias control entire cities. Foreign troops patrol its soil. Oil fields are auctioned to the highest bidder. Infrastructure has collapsed. Elections remain a promise without delivery. More than a decade after NATO's liberation, whatever else he was, Gaddafi understood the real game. And in the end, he paid the ultimate price not for tyranny, but for defiance. Not for madness, but for refusing to bow. Because in a world where the empire wears the mask of morality, the greatest crime is to point out that the mask is a lie. In the official story told to the world, Muammar Gaddafi died in the chaos of war. Just another dictator brought down by the fury of his people. A violent end, yes, but supposedly spontaneous. A casualty of a rebel mob in Sirte. That version made for clean headlines. It fits the West's narrative. It sounded democratic, even poetic. It was easy to digest, easy to deny, and easy to move on from. But it wasn't the truth, because when you peel back the layers, into classified Pentagon cables, internal NATO briefings, French military logs, and leaked diplomatic memos, a very different picture begins to emerge. A picture not of chaos, but of coordination. Not of a lucky rebel ambush, but of a decision made in boardrooms and war rooms. Gaddafi's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of a war spiraling out of control. It was a policy choice, calculated, deliberate, and executed with precision. He was never meant to survive, because alive, Gaddafi was a problem no one wanted to solve. Alive, he was a trial waiting to happen, a microphone with years of classified memories, a vault full of inconvenient truths. He knew too much, had recorded too much, and had survived too many attempts. His survival meant exposure. And so, in October 2011, they made sure that didn't happen. He didn't die in the chaos. He died in the cleanup. It began with surveillance. Intelligence intercepts in late 2011 revealed Gaddafi was still moving, from one safe house to another, still communicating, still rallying loyalists. He wasn't hiding in silence. He was broadcasting defiance. Audio messages were released almost daily, urging Libyans to resist foreign manipulation and warning the region that what was happening wasn't revolution, but foreign conquest. That worried Western intelligence more than any battlefield loss. Analysts inside the Pentagon were stunned by his continued popularity, especially in Libya's south and among tribal regions. He was more resilient, more supported, and more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. If Gaddafi reached Saba, a stronghold with deep tribal loyalty, the war could grind on for years. The diplomatic risk would explode. The public narrative would fracture. The chance that Gaddafi would one day sit in front of a global court with documents in hand? Unthinkable. That's when the quiet directive came down. No press conference, no official order. Just one phrase passed through intelligence channels. Neutralize the target. Not captured, not negotiate, not brought to justice. Neutralize. From that moment on, NATO's humanitarian mission ended. It became a manhunt. The final days of the operation weren't driven by rebels. They were directed, guided, and observed by foreign military assets. On October 20th, the US Reaper drone flew over Sirte. It had been tracking a convoy suspected of carrying Gaddafi and his bodyguards. The moment the signal was confirmed, a French Mirage fighter jet launched a missile, hitting the convoy and scattering survivors. Gaddafi was injured but alive. His guards were disoriented, and vehicles were destroyed. He crawled into a drainage ditch, bleeding, cornered, waiting. But the next people to arrive weren't just rebels. French special forces, embedded in rebel units and disguised in civilian clothes, were on the ground that day. French defense sources have since confirmed their presence. They were not just observing, they were located, communicating, directing. Every movement was tracked. Every route is mapped. Yet to this day, no Western military has acknowledged what orders those foreign soldiers were carrying. When Gaddafi was dragged from that pipe, the cameras were already rolling. He was beaten, humiliated, spat on, kicked. No one stopped the mob. No one intervened. No Western advisor radioed in a demand for arrest. No drone paused its surveillance feed to alert command. He was shot in the head, and then shot again. A rebel held up Gaddafi's golden pistol, smiling for the camera. Another shouted, "We got him!" But even amid the screaming, the stomping, the dust and rage, one thing was clear. No one tried to take him alive. Because no one wanted him alive. There was no plan for a courtroom, no interest in a tribunal. Because Gaddafi, in chains with a microphone, could name names. He could testify. He could expose. Death was the only acceptable outcome. And death, captured on camera and broadcast to the world, ensured the silence would last forever. Then came the confirmation. Just days later, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, whose State Department had been instrumental in coordinating the NATO intervention, sat down for an interview. Laughing, she said the now infamous words, "We came, we saw, he died." The grin said more than any classified memo ever could. It wasn't a joke. It was a confession. Clinton had lobbied the UN, rallied skeptical allies, pushed President Obama toward action, and maintained close coordination with Sarkozy and Cameron. She knew the real mission. It was never just about Gaddafi's governance. It was about eliminating what he knew. And Gaddafi knew too much. He wasn't just a leader, he was a vault. Inside that vault were secrets the West couldn't afford to leak. Detailed records of CIA torture sites operated inside Libya, oil contracts signed in back rooms with Western firms, financial transfers including the infamous 50 million euros sent to Sarkozy, back-channel deals with Bush and Blair, and funding sent to African liberation movements across the continent. If he had gone to trial, none of it would stay buried. The United States didn't want another Saddam Hussein moment, a captured dictator testifying under cross-examination. France didn't want a media circus centered around Sarkozy's bribe. And NATO didn't want to explain why a UN no-fly zone evolved into a drone strike that ended in an execution. So Gaddafi's body was left in a freezer, on public display. Not for justice, for intimidation. After the execution, the story wrapped up neatly. The war was declared over. No international inquiry was opened. No one was prosecuted for the killing of a sitting head of state. Western officials congratulated themselves. The press moved on. But in Africa, and the shadows of political resistance, the truth settled in like dust after a bombing run. Gaddafi wasn't overthrown. He was assassinated, not because he was oppressed, not because he invaded, but because he dared to break free, because he tried to build something independent. An African financial system, an African army, an African voice, because he printed money, not debt, because he paid for his military, not with IMF loans, but with oil and gold, because he threatened to speak, and had he lived, he would have told the truth, a truth the empire couldn't afford to let the world hear. Libya, after October 2011, was not free. It wasn't democratic. It wasn't reborn. It was broken, bleeding from wounds carved not just by bombs, but by betrayal. The world celebrated as if a tyrant had fallen and a nation had been saved. But the truth stood silent in the rubble. Muammar Gaddafi's body was paraded like a trophy through the streets of Sirte. His bloodied corpse became a spectacle. Selfies were taken with it. His iconic golden pistol was passed around like a cursed souvenir from a vanquished era. And as the world watched, the so-called champions of democracy, the polite, rules-based international order, responded not with shame, but with smugness. Mission accomplished, they said. But what exactly was accomplished? Because when the cheering stopped and the cameras were packed away, when NATO jets returned to base and the headlines moved on, what remained was not a new constitution, not freedom, not elections, not peace. What remained was silence. The kind of silence that comes not from victory, but from mass graves. The kind that follows a political assassination disguised as a liberation. The kind that whispers of betrayal. Libya, once Africa's most developed and independently run nation, was reduced to a failed state in under a year. Public schools collapsed, hospitals shut down, power grids flickered and died, fuel lines vanished into black market networks. Foreign corporations moved swiftly to seize oil fields. In the void, militias rose. Warlords took cities. ISIS established strongholds. Human trafficking exploded. Slave markets returned to the continent, where black African migrants were sold to the highest bidder like cattle. Libya is a fractured land, split between rival governments, mercenary warlords, and foreign powers treating it like an auction block. No longer a country. It's a cautionary tale. And yet, the world still dares to call what happened liberation. Not for weapons, but for diplomacy. He offered to step down, to hold internationally monitored elections, to negotiate a peaceful transition under African supervision, but the world ignored him. NATO refused the AU's peace proposal. The UN shut African leaders out of negotiations. And when Gaddafi was finally hunted down and killed, the AU said nothing. Not because they didn't understand what had happened, but because they feared it might happen to them next. Because Gaddafi's death wasn't just a moment, it was a warning. It sent a signal across the global south to every president who dared to nationalize oil, reject IMF loans, build sovereign banks, or question the petrodollar. It said, don't try this again. Don't you dare step out of line. And across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, leaders heard the message loud and clear. Suddenly, the speeches stopped. Currency plans went quiet, were folded back into university classrooms. The lesson was terrifying in its simplicity. You don't have to invade a country to control it. You have to kill the one man brave enough to say no. Gaddafi was not a mistake, the byproduct of chaos, template, blueprint of 21st century regime change. Demonize the leader, flood the media with lies, use humanitarian language to gain military entry, arm rebels, create chaos, assassinate the leadership, claim the people are free, then walk away, leaving the country in ruins. That blueprint worked in Libya. It was attempted in Syria. It's being murmured now in corners of the world where leaders still think they can resist global financial and military hegemony. People learn to see the pattern, unless we call it what it is. Modern colonialism with better PR. Again, to count for is this: he wasn't just a man. He was an idea. Ideas do not die in ditches. Soil of Burkina Faso, in the resistance chants of Mali and Niger, in the clenched fists of protesters in Kenya, and the black flags replacing French ones in the Sahel. The idea is rising again. In Zimbabwe, land reform is no longer whispered in shame. In Congo, leaders speak openly of currency independence. Are reading the Green Book not as dogma, but as defiance. Gaddafi's voice, silenced by a bullet, is still echoing in the minds of those who heard what he was trying to build. The speaker. But they didn't kill the message. Every African who refuses World Bank conditions, in every leader who says no to foreign bases, in every village that chooses dignity over debt, the dream is not dead. It sleeps, not in parliaments or policy briefs, but in the hearts of those who remember what happened the last time someone dared to stand tall. Because one day, someone will rise again, and this time, they will remember the trap. They will remember the lies. They will remember what the West calls liberation and what Africa knows as erasure. And when they rise, they won't make the same mistake. Because Gaddafi was not killed because he was cruel. He was killed because he was free, and he wanted his people to be free too. His body lies cold. But if Africa ever truly rises, it will be because someone, somewhere, heard his voice from that ditch and did not forget. Do you think? They killed the man. But did they kill his vision of Africa? Will another Gaddafi come to save Africa? Let us know in the comment section. Will Africa repeat the mistake of trusting the West again? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.